Okay, I'm going to start this session. Hello, everyone. My name is actually Kiara Yates. I know you have Nicole Soto names appears because she is registered with the account and she used to hold the live webinars. She's moved on to other positions, and for this semester, I am conducting the live webinars. And I'm an adjunct faculty with SNHU. I've been working here since 2012, and I usually teach micro or macroeconomics. So I'm well versed. I've opened up, we'll start with microeconomics, and then we can continue later with, at 9 o'clock, we'll stop and we'll switch to macroeconomics. So if you're here for macro, you can sit in and listen, or you can wait a half hour and come back. We're going to start with micro. We're going to go over what the requirements of Milestone 2 are for this, for your final, to contribute to your final. Now this week, you're actually going to discuss a really important topic that you went over in chapter 3 of Hubbard, which is supply and demand conditions. And you're going to research the supply and demand for your company, the firm you have chosen. The supply and demand conditions constitute two elements in your rubric, and we will go look at the rubric real quick as soon as we've gone over the document. The two elements, first of all, you're going to evaluate the demand trend, so you're going to focus on demand, and then after, you're going to do the second element, which focuses on demand and supply together. How do you evaluate the demand trends over time? When one of the resources provided to you, depending which firm you chose, was some of the financial statements of the firms you have chosen. And you can find those on the website, on the main website of the firm you have chosen, because they have to be shared with the shareholders. When you go in the financial statements, you can find the sales figures. And when you find the sales figures, you'll be able to find out how much is sold, and so how much demand is. In addition to finding the sales figure, you also want to identify who your consumer is. So who is purchasing the product sold by your firm, and give a brief description of the consumer that your firm is trying to get, is trying to conquer and trying to sell to. Provide some details on the consumers. Use the annual sales data to find out how much of the product is purchased. If you see on this on the supply and demand conditions on this paper, there is a link, and so here's a video explains each of the following determinants of market demand. If you follow these 5 determinants of market demand in developing your trends in demand over time, you cannot fail on this milestone. You will have fulfilled all the requirements of the rubric. The determinants of demand are income, price of related goods, taste, populations and demographic, and expected future prices. Those are the 5 determinants that drive consumption, that make you decide, basically, if you're going to buy a good or not buy a good. Show your data. So when you're writing the information and you're explaining the trends in demand, use the data, like use the numbers. And when we're talking of trends over time, we're talking over a time period of 5 years. So go back 5 years, and that's how you can establish a demand trend. And using the data that you find, the sales figures, how much have they sold every year of their product, you can also show the highs and the lows, if they sold more, they sold less in over the 5-year period. The second element of the rubric requires you, yes, to use the demand you found, but also use the supply information that you have. It says include a graph, a chart of the sales of your company. So again, always use the data, use graphs and tables to illustrate your trends, and you can never go wrong. And then you have to discuss supply. How are you going to discuss supply? Again, you can analyze the determinants of supply. And again, here there is another link on this document that you can link to and watch a video on the determinants of supply. The determinants of supply are input costs, technological improvements, prices of substitutes, numbers of firm in the market and expected future prices. So if you go by these 5 determinants to explain and analyze the supply trends of your company, you won't go wrong. And you discuss supply and demand together. You know how when you study demand, you first study the demand side, you study the supply, and then you put it together to find your equilibrium. And that's pretty much what this is requiring you to do, is to analyze the demand trends, and then in the second section to analyze it together with the supply. This document is this is the sample paper in terms of it goes, well, this is a PDF here. You can, Bridget, you can find this in your course content. So if you go in your course materials and you go on the final resources, on the final project, final paper resources, you will find this document along with like the final paper rubric. They're in the same area. They're in the same area of your classroom. And you can download this, and it just goes through all the items required by the essay in the final. And so there's links in it that you can go look videos from, and then it explains element by element what the requirements are. And so if you use this document in conjunction with the rubric, you can't go wrong. You'll be able to fulfill all the requirements. So the first 2 elements focus on demand and supply. Demand more than, demand as a whole, and then demand and supply together. Yes, thank you, Lynette. The supplemental resources are there. I don't know if you click on that link, if everybody will be able to have access to it if you're in the same course or not. But if you go in your, if you go into your classroom, you can find the, yes, you can find the final paper, or it's called the final paper resources or supplemental resources, and it's going to be there together with the rubrics. Now the second section, the second part that's going to be the focus of this milestone is price elasticity of demand. This is a really important part and an important topic of the whole course, together with supply and demand. I really cannot stress enough, learn well supply and demand, because it's the basics of microeconomics, and you will need it in macroeconomics. Learn it really well, try to understand it. If you have trouble, reach out to your instructor to find more resources. Watch the videos on the Khan Academy. They're a really good resource to learn about supply and demand. Once you have understood supply and demand and you've analyzed your firm's supply and demand, you will be able to discuss price elasticity of demand. You will be able, because you will be able to establish the change in demand and consumption related to the changes in prices that have occurred to your product over a period of time. This section here, it says it's 3 elements, and it should be 1 to 2 pages long, and you want to analyze the information and the data to justify how the price elasticity of demand for your product is determined. You don't necessarily have to get a formula and calculate it, but you have to explain that you have observed changes in demand corresponding, say, to changes in price. So maybe the price decreased and demand increased. That means there's a certain degree of price elasticity. If vice versa happen, if the price increases and demand decreases, then you can also establish that there's a certain degree of price elasticity. Now, the price elasticity is a range. It can go from being inelastic, where there's a 0 change, and that's perfectly inelastic. And then there can be just inelastic, where there's a very small change, which is less than 1 to 1. And then there's elastic, which means there is, a noticeable change in demand when the price changes. There's all these shades of gray in between. So it's not just either elastic or inelastic. It could be fairly inelastic or fairly elastic. And you really want to use those words to determine the price elasticity. So when you watch at the changes in price over time and you compare them to the changes in demand over time, you will be able to establish a trend in terms of price elasticity. How did consumption of my product change when the prices changes? Again, here for price elasticity, there's another link to a video that you can watch if you want to learn more about it. But once you've established if the product is price elastic or price inelastic, you can also justify your determination by using the determinants of price elasticity of demand. And there's 5 determinants of price elasticity of demand. If there's substitutes available, that makes a good price elastic. The passage of time. So for example, if a price goes up for a good, in the immediate future, you may not change consumption of that good, but with time, you may change it. For example, when the price of gasoline goes up, you're not all of a sudden not going to buy gasoline anymore because you still need to fill up your tank and you still need to go to work. However, if the price of gasoline remains up for a longer time, you might purchase a more fuel efficient vehicle and reduce your consumption of gasoline. So over a period of time, with the passage of time, you might change your consumption habits and consume more or less of a certain good depending on the changes in price. If the good is a luxury or a necessity. If you can do without it, you're probably going to reduce consumption or you're going to eliminate it from your consumption. If it's a necessity, like, I don't know, buying milk maybe for your kids, you're still going to keep buying it. And you're still, you're going to pay the price for it, and you're probably just going to change your habits somewhere else to make up the money. The definition of the market is also important. If the company is, what kind of competition there is, then that determines how many other products are available. Then that will determine also how you do your consumption and the share of the budget. How much does that good that you're using impact your budget? And depending on how much, like if, for example, you never check the price of milk because it doesn't really matter, no matter what, it's not a big item on your budget because maybe you don't consume a lot of it. Then milk goes up, you're still going to buy it. You don't really notice because maybe you just buy a gallon every 2 weeks and it's not a big deal. So when you examine these 5 determinants of price elasticity, you will be able to justify and explain why you decided, based on your data and based on your determinants, that the product or the service that your firm is providing has price elastic demand or not. The third element that you're going to examine in the price elasticity is assess how the price elasticity of demand impacts the firm's pricing decisions. And this is really important. This is why the firm needs to know if the product is price elastic or not. Because if they know, then they might do everything in their power not to change their price. And they might try to reduce their costs of production elsewhere to maintain a lower price. Or they may not care, like gasoline goes up all the time. People still keep buying it. It's not an immediate shock. It's not going to be an immediate change, the consumption of gasoline. And so there's less worry sometimes of what the price is going to be on a certain good. So these are the elements that you will be going through. And this is it. This is all for Milestone 2. So you just want to go into depth with these elements. You want to explain why you've decided that a good is price elastic or not price elastic. And you want to use the data, and you will be able to use the data that you also researched when you were analyzing the demand and the supply for the good. I'm going to stop sharing this and I will open the rubric. This way we can also look at it. Echo 201. I think it's this. Let me see if I got it. Yep. So when we go on the rubric, I'm going to open the rubric of the final. The reason I'm opening the rubric of the final as compared to the Milestone 2 rubric is because in the final you have an extra category of exemplary that is not present in the Milestone 2 rubric. Is the Milestone 2 content submitted in a document by itself or appended to what was submitted? Karen, this is a question that you might want to ask your instructor. In my classes, honestly, I'm indifferent whether the students continue they continue under Milestone 1 and make it just one document, or if they submit them separately. I don't care, but some instructors do care and they would prefer to have them separately. Some instructors like them together, so you need to ask your instructor. Marcia, this is due by Sunday at midnight. Yes, 11:59 p.m. to be accurate. And Crystal, the cost of production is not part of this milestone. Cost of production is part of Milestone 3. So you won't have to worry about costs of production here. For Milestone 2, we're just going to look at the conditions or impact. Let me see if I can show the arrow here, because sometimes there's a way that I can show the arrow. But anyways, you're going to see conditions, impact, and conditions, firms, actions. So these two elements of the rubric regard demand and supply. Yes, you may ask, Christine, you may ask a question when we're done. Bridget, you might be able to find the graph online. Some firms do have, for some firms, I've noticed students have found trends, demand trends, over a period of 5 years or more. It depends really on the firm that you found and what information is available. If it's not available, you might have to build one, putting some data in Excel. It's pretty straightforward because you would do a column, say, showing the years, a column showing the data, and then when you highlight it all and you tell it to create a graph, it will create a graph for you that then you can export to Word. Going back to the rubric, the conditions, if you see in the proficient, it says effectively evaluates the trends in demand over time and explains their impact on the industry and the firm. But for the exemplary, it explains in detail the reasons for the trend. So if you want to start working on your Milestone 2 and try to be exemplary already now so that you don't have to go back and rework it, you can start looking at that exemplary column and start just putting that extra information. I mean, you're already researching it, you are already writing about it, and it's maybe like another paragraph to add that will save you time when you get to the final. The same for the actions, the firm's action is the proficient criteria is met, but then you also provide some concrete examples of supply and demand. And so in this case, you analyze information data related to demand and supply for the firm's product to support recommendations for the firm's actions, and you include graphical representation of the data and the information. So when you develop the demand and supply side, you definitely want to provide a graph. And that's even just to be proficient for Milestone 2. A data, you can have a table, you can have a graph, you just want to show something visual. For the price elasticity analysis, use the data and the information available and justify how you determined that the price elasticity of demand of a product is price elastic or not price elastic, and you explain the factors. And so for the price consumer responsiveness, when you explain the factors, is you're explaining those 5 determinants of price elasticity, and to be exemplary, you review all the factors. So say, for example, you only explain 3 determinants of price elasticity for the Milestone 2, you should be proficient. But if you do all 5, you're going to be exemplary in the final. So you might as well just do all 5 while you're at it. And this way you don't have to go back and work on this part of the section. You can focus on providing your recommendations and other parts when you're ready to work on the final. And the last part of the price elasticity of demand is the pricing decisions. So assess how the price elasticity of demand impacts the firm's pricing decisions and revenue growth, and illustrate your claims. So to be exemplary, all you have to do is provide an illustration. So a graph, a table to show, or numbers, something concrete to show how the pricing decisions have been determined. And this is all you have to do for Milestone 2. Always remember, there's also the section articulations of response. So you have to apply APA guidelines, and you have to correctly cite and reference all your sources. If your source is cited in the content, then there needs to be a reference that corresponds to it. If you have a reference a source reference and it's not cited in the content, that's also a mistake. The citations and the references need to correspond. That is all for Milestone 2. We can go on to questions. We have a few minutes to answer any questions you may have. Christine, you had one. And then we can wrap it up at 9 o'clock and move on to macroeconomics. You need to get hired. Oh, in the introduction and purpose, Christine, if you go watch the video for if you go watch the video for Milestone 1 that's in YouTube, you can it explains the purpose and the introduction. But basically in the introduction, what are you doing is you're pretending to be a consultant for the firm and you're explaining why you're carrying out this research for the firm. So you're going to use some general economic concepts in terms of saying that you're going to do some research on the firm, analyze demand and supply, because you're going to find out how the firm can grow or improve in the future. You can find a graph, Crystal. You can find a graph and you can use it. Marsha, I see you raise your hand. I don't know if you have a question. If you find the graph, better. I have seen students who have found graphs with trends over the 5 years, and they've used them. If you don't find a graph, you will have to build one, or you can build a table if you don't know how to build a graph. Well, what a strong thesis. Well, in the introduction, you would what would be that, because when you write the whole paper, you do all the research, and then in the end, you're going to provide recommendations. There's 3 sections. There's 3 types of recommendations you're going to provide for your firm. So in the introduction, your strong thesis is how are you going to inform the conclusions? What is you're not going to, you don't know what your recommendations are yet because you haven't conducted all the research. But in your introduction, you can explain what your scope is. What are you aiming for? Why are you carrying out this research? And that will give you a strong conclusion to your introduction. Yes, you besides Yahoo Finance, even just sometimes like you can say, for example, Tesla. You can write Tesla demand trends. And sometimes there's websites, there's news articles that might have those trends because they are analyzing the firm. So the financial section of a newspaper might be analyzing your firm and might have already created a graph with some trends on it that you can use. Beth, it looks like you've raised your hands. I don't know if you have a question. So yeah, Yahoo Finance can help, but also the finance sections of other newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times, the Financial Times, which is actually owned by Pearson, is also. So Beth, are you trying to write a? You can't. I don't have the microphones enabled for the individual students. So if you need to ask a question, you'll just have to type it. Oh, you're welcome, Jacqueline. And if you have any other questions, really reach out to your instructors. They do have the answers for you. This webinar will be available on the SNHU channel. You also have a really valuable resource in your class. I'm going to share it now. If you go in your classroom and you go into My Econ Lab, let me see, share my screen. Let me see if I know how to do this. And if you go, let me see if it works. There, so if you go into your classroom, into the My Econ Lab Multimedia Library, this library then appears like this when you click on it. And if you see, you can go on chapters. So if you go on chapter 3, which is the demand and supply, you can you can select, say, for example, PowerPoint. You can select video. I like the PowerPoint, and you find it. And then when you find the PowerPoint, you can open it. And it's really handy because the PowerPoint really explains well demand and supply in general. But you might find, see, you can find a graph that you might be able to adapt to your firm. You can show how demand increases and decreases. It goes through the determinants of demand. So like income on consumers, prices of related good, taste, population, and expected future prices. And it explains everything. So you can, the substitutes and the complements, and you can use this information to help you with developing your your demand and supply section. And the same thing you can do for the next chapters that focus on where's my file? The same you can do with the other chapters that focus on price elasticity. You can find all the determinants of price elasticity and go over them in a much faster way than you would if you were using the textbook. So I'm glad, Crystal, thank you for coming and for joining in. We have a few more minutes before we're going to switch over to macroeconomics. So if you have any questions, ask away, and we'll soon be switching. Sandra, I have, oh, Sandra, can you hear me now? I just noticed you left a message here maybe some time ago, which I hadn't noticed before. Okay, thank you. My God. Otherwise, you can access the recording by going to the SNHU channel or just by waiting for your instructor to put the link in the announcements. I'm going to send out an email tomorrow morning, first thing in the morning. Oh, okay. Yeah, that happens to have the mute on. I'm going to send a link first thing in the morning to all the instructors so that they can share it in the classroom. The SNHU channel is on YouTube. If you go on YouTube, write SNHU Echo channel. I think it's, you can find, you can access all the past webinars too. So if you'd like to, you can watch this webinar. You can even go watch the webinar from the previous semester and the one before. And, you know, which were held by Nicole, not by me. So it's a different person talking. She might have said something else that could have been relevant and interesting for you. She might have gone over different questions. You know, they're pretty useful to watch, even if you watch more than one. You should like it. Oh, you're welcome, Sandra. There's also other videos on the SNHU channel. Nicole has made other videos that could help you with other parts of the class, and you might be able to find them on there. But if you write Milestone 2, 18 EW16, you will definitely, it'll be the first thing that pops up. AW6, it'll be the first thing that pops up on YouTube. So it's 9 o'clock. We're going to end Echo 201 and we're going to start Echo 202. I would like to welcome all the, oh, you're welcome, Nicole. Thank you. I would like to welcome the Echo 202. Hi. You're welcome, Maria. Let me open up the Echo 202 document. And there we go. So we're going to start going over macroeconomics. I'll introduce myself again. My name is Kiara Yates. I'm holding the live webinars in place of Nicole Soto. She holds the account, so her name appears because she has changed position. So for this semester, I'll be holding the webinars. We're going to start now the webinar and going over the requirements of Milestone 2 for macroeconomics. So Echo 202. Milestone 2 for macroeconomics requires you to research the fiscal policies that happened before, and during your decade, and to identify the impact that the fiscal policies had on your decade. So you want to, basically the first slide, and this is something that I've noticed is often misunderstood by students, but the first slide, it asks you to look at the policies in place at the start of your chosen decade. This means that the policies were already in place. If you chose the 1990s, it will not be the fiscal policies enacted in 1990 because that is already your decade. You will choose the fiscal policies enacted during the 1980s that carried their effects and that determined why the 1990s started with a brief recession, for example. The same for the 1960s, or, you know, going into the 1970s, 1970s going into the 1980s. So the first slide, you will provide details on the policies, and it says examine how they were related to macroeconomic issues of the time. In the slides, you will only use the slides to highlight your key points. So for example, in the 1980s, you could highlight that in 1989 there was the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was the start of the end of the Cold War. In the late 1980s, there was, you know, all the Reaganomics fiscal policies that was starting to build up effects. So you can use all those. You can highlight key points of those policies that you think carry their impact into the 1990s, if that's your decade, or into whichever decade you did. And it says you might have to take a peek in the years leading up to the start of your decade. So you might even have to look sometimes earlier than the decade before, just 2 or 3 years before your decade started. I mean, for example, the 1980s started with really high inflation. That was caused by the stagflation and high inflation of the 1970s. But the high inflation of the 1970s was really brought up by, you know, the policies enacted in the late 1960s with the war on poverty. So if you look, you could go back a while, but you know, you don't want to look too much into it. You don't want to, you know, have to write a book about it. You just want to highlight a few policies that to you are relevant and that impacted your decade. There's a few links here that you can use. The White House website is pretty useful because you can identify the presidents that that enacted those fiscal policies, and it'll tell you all they did in terms of government policies. So that's pretty useful Oh, you know what? We are still early, I noticed, for the, oh no, we're not. Okay. The second part of I was having a moment there. Sorry, guys. I was looking at the time, and I thought I was in the wrong time for the wrong class, but I'm not. The second part of the fiscal policy actions is then discuss the fiscal policy actions of your decade. So you should identify the policies. You have to identify 2 or 3 of the most important policies of your decade. You don't have to, like, for example, in the 2000s, there's a lot of fiscal policies, right? Because between the war on terror and all there are smaller fiscal policies that were used to stir the economy, bigger ones, there's a lot. All you have to do is identify the major ones. You can, like the Recovery Acts, for example. Those are the biggest ones. You just want to make sure you cover the whole decade, though. So if your decade is 2000 to 2010, you can't start in 2005 and forget the 5 years before that. What happened in those 5 years? So always make sure to cover the whole decade. In this section for the policy in action, you can use macroeconomic principles and models. It is encouraged to use the model, so you can use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. You can find a copy of a graph of the ADAS in the PowerPoints that Hubbard made, and those PowerPoints are available through the MyEcon Lab in the MyEcon Lab resources. So if you go in there, you can just select your chapter, and you can find PowerPoints that have graphs on it and tables, and you might be able to use them in your PowerPoint as visual aids. Keep the main points in the slide and then develop the content in the speaker notes. So for the first slide, you keep the main policies in the slide, and then in the speaker notes, you would explain what type of impact they had on your decade. In the fiscal policy actions, so in the second slide that focuses on your decade, you identify 2, 3, 4 maybe of the main, most important policies of your decade. And then in the speaker notes, you explain exactly what the intent of those policies were. Why were those policies enacted? What were they supposed to achieve? You're not explaining what they did achieve, because that's in the next slide. You explain why, what were they hoping to achieve. What they did achieve will be included in the third slide, the fiscal policy impact. So after you've analyzed the fiscal policies and what their intent was, so the intent was like curbing inflation or decreasing unemployment or spurring the economy in general, what the intent, then here you can explain if that intent was achieved. So by using the data that you researched in Milestone 1, so using the information that you used, like the GDP information, the unemployment information, and the inflation information, you will be able to use that data. Just go look, how was the GDP affected? How was unemployment affected? You can use some of those numbers to explain the impact of the fiscal policies on your decade. And then you also have to explain, which is really important to be proficient and even at least exemplary for the final, you also have to explain how did these policy affect individual households and how did they affect businesses. So for example, if there's a fiscal policy that invested in infrastructures, like for example, in the late 60s, you have the big Eisenhower enacted the Highway Act. So it started building highways everywhere. I mean, how did that affect individual households and businesses? Well, it affected individuals for sure, because you could travel cross country more easily, go on vacation without having, without being a burden. How did it affect businesses? Greatly. I mean, it produced work for a lot of people for a certain amount of time. And businesses now could transport their goods across country more easily. So maybe instead of just selling locally, they were able to sell to the neighboring state or even across the country. So identifying the impact on businesses and households is also an important part of this section to get a proficient or even an exemplary grade. There is an important point here made. Keep in mind that there be times when the government misread the economy and implemented a policy that had unintended effects. So it's important to compare what was observed after the policy in the macroeconomic data to what the policy objectives were. And this is why it is important that in the second slide, when you're identifying the fiscal policies, you identify what the intent of those policies were, because when you are actually explaining the impact of the policies, you can contrast and say, well, the intent was to reduce unemployment, but that intent was not achieved. For example, at the beginning of the 2000 started with a recession, a brief recession. And by the time that recession was recorded and the government enacted its fiscal policies, the recession was finished. It was over. It was just a very brief recession. It only lasted a few months. But because there's a time lag in the fiscal policy from the time we find out we're in a recession, because how do we find out we're in a recession? When you have negative GDP growth. But you need the 2 consecutive quarters. And by the time that GDP is calculated, it's like the GDP for now, July, is not known yet. It's not even going to be known August 1st. It's going to be known a couple of months from now. And by the time that is known, we've already entered the recession or not. And so we really find out about being in a recession several months after we've already been in it. And if that is a brief recession, by the time the government decides to enact a fiscal policy that has to be approved by Congress and then has to be enacted, it takes time. And by then, the recession of 2000 was over. And really, the fiscal policy was still enacted. It still had an impact. It might have had a positive impact, and you can research it. But it had lost really its purpose because it wasn't fixing a recession anymore. And then after the U.S. was hit by the Twin Tower attacks, which also caused other economic difficulties, and then spurred other moves like the war on terror, which is a big increase in government spending, so it can be considered a fiscal policy, also besides a really important event that affects the economy. The war is not enacted to improve the economy or, affect the economy. It's, we go to war to defend ourselves. So it can be considered an event for the purpose of Milestone One, but it is also a fiscal policy that can be used to determine the impact of the fiscal policies. Does anybody have any questions up to now that we can address? I see Jody is typing something. Before we go to the last. Can you show us some of the research options from the first slide? I can't seem to figure out what I'm looking for. So the first slide, let me see. So the Congressional Budget Office I've really never used to find information. The National Bureau of Economic Research is very useful to find some information because they have some papers where you could just read maybe the first 2 pages off, like the introduction or the the summary of, and that would be enough for you to identify some policies. Or the White House website. When you go on the White House website, you can go and find the presidents. So if you say, for example, you're researching the policies during the Reagan time, you can find Reagan, and then you can find the you can find the policies he enacted. So let me see if I can show you the website real quick, and that might help you. But if you go on the White House website, and then I'll have to share it. You got economy. You can actually research the names of the presidents. And you can, when you go on the White House website, you can research the names of the president, and it'll just give you like a history of all the presidents all the presidents and what they did. Let me see if I can. Let me just find it a minute before I share the page, because I don't want you to get confused. But if you go, let me find the correct link. Here it is. So let me stop sharing this and I'll share my screen. And I think this is it. I won't be able to see your questions while I'm sharing my screen. But basically, if you go on the whitehouse.gov, you can see it's about the White House. Here's the link. Adrian, you're not really repeating yourself, because in Milestone One, you are analyzing data. So you're researching the GDP and the events that affected your decade. And when we're talking of events, we're not talking of fiscal policies. We're talking of actual historical events. If you tell me, for example, what decade you're researching, Adrian, I could give you a more... It's not a repeat of the events of Milestone One, because in Milestone One, you are identifying historical and current events. So, for example, an important event in 2000 is the war on terror, is the Twin Tower attack, for example. The recession is not an event for the purpose of Milestone One, because that's an economic event. It's economic outcome caused by other events. Another event could be is Hurricane Katrina, is a big historical current event. In the 1990s, the 90s started with the Gulf War. That's an event. So you're not repeating yourself, because when you're when you're discussing the events and you're discussing how they impacted the economy, you're talking of events that were not did not exist to impact the economy. Fiscal policies are policies that are made to impact the economy. You know, the government enacts changes government spending and taxation because they want to achieve an economic change, which could be to speed up the economy or to slow down the economy because maybe we're going too fast. When we're talking of the events of Milestone One, we are talking of the events like in the 70s, the oil embargo. That's an event that had an economic impact because the oil was so expensive. It increased the prices of all goods and it exacerbated inflation. The war on poverty in itself could be some sort of event, but that's also a fiscal policy that was enacted, implemented, and pushed because they wanted to reduce unemployment and reduce poverty. So it had it was enacted with the intent of having an economic outcome. The space race during the 1960s, that's an economic event. The war in Vietnam is a historical event. The war in Vietnam is an historical event. The Korean War is an historical event. All the wars are historical events, even if they're also a fiscal aspect because they increase government spending. Because all the wars were not, engaged to have an economic outcome. We went into war for political reasons. So if you go on this page of the president that I'm sharing, and you scroll down, you can learn more about each president. And so you scroll, and you can go, for example, let's do the 90s because they have good relevant policies. You can just go on Clinton and see he took office at the end of the Cold War. So that could be an important thing. The end of the Cold War, 1990s, really important historical event because once the Cold War is ended, what happens? You have a lot more countries in the global scenery, in the global scene that Adrian. So see, we must have telepathy because I chose the 1990s. Right. So, Adrian, in Milestone One, if you pointed out the fiscal policy in your introduction, in your overview slide, that's not a big deal. But if you use the fiscal policies as events, like for me, when I grade, I grade a needs improvement there because you didn't identify historical or current events. You identified a fiscal policy, which had the purpose of affecting the GDP. In the 1990s, the end of the Cold War could have had an effect on the GDP. Why could it have had that effect? Because maybe not because necessarily it did anything to US, but maybe because people were more positive about the world. And if you're happy and you're positive and your expectations are positive, you're going to spend more money, right? I mean, we all know during these years of recession, we've all been pretty bummed because it didn't look like unemployment was recovering. We didn't know if the economy was recovering. We always read this bad news about it. And I think that really affected the recovery. It slowed down our recovery because we were also worried, are we recovering from this recession? And we didn't spend probably as much as we would have had we had a more positive outlook on it. Now all the articles are saying that our economy is booming, we're doing great, the housing market is recovered, everybody's buying a house again. The economy is going strong again because everybody is spending. So during, say, for example, here, the Clinton administration, you can see like he tried to do a healthcare reform, which didn't go through. But later on, you'll be able to see that he did all the acts to reduce the budget deficit. That's the big thing Clinton did in terms of fiscal policy. But when you read through the presidents, you might also be able to find that there were some historical or current events that you might not have been aware of because they were happening abroad. Yes, Adrian, I would suggest you review it and just really focus. If you go read in the rubric, and I'll open the rubric in a minute, it really says that you need to find historical and current. So saying, for example, that in 2008 we got hit by the recession, that is not a it is history, obviously, because the Great Recession is going to make history, but because this is an economics class, the recession is the outcome of other historical events. I mean, the recession is the outcome of the housing bubble. So the housing bubble is a current event in the 2000s that led to the recession. The war on terror is one event that also weakened our economy because we were spending so much money on the war effort, that eventually led us to the recession. And so those events are valid. The Economic Recovery Act is not an event of the 2000s, because obviously it was enacted to affect the GDP, right? So you can use those events, Adrian, in the speaker notes of when you're examining growth. So when you have to explain the relevance of the growth rates, you can briefly mention that, you notice that there was an increasing growth when the first Budget Deficit Act was enacted by Clinton. You can briefly mention it. I wouldn't go into depth in explaining it because you're going to explain it when you analyze the fiscal policies. I hope if that makes sense. Let me open this more, and I will share the rubric. Let me see, Adobe Connect. Well, that's not what I wanted to share. Okay, so if we do, so if we go through the rubric, and I'll briefly go back to Milestone 1 since that seems to be something that concerns you. And you can read it even here in the explanation up here. It says choose 2 or 3 of the most relevant events from this time period that impacted the US economy and apply the models to show how these events impacted the economy. But when you go to the actual rubric, it will tell you that let me see where it is. How relevant, if you read here in the set where it says examination, GDP, influence national output, it'll say that you apply specific models developed throughout the course to demonstrate how relevant historical and or current events have influenced national output. So it has to be historical and or current events, not fiscal policies. So I would suggest, if Milestone 1's already been graded, you can go see the feedback. Your instructor should have provided some feedback regarding Milestone 1 if you chose mostly fiscal policies, and how they impacted your decade, because the fiscal policies are examined in Milestone 2. If you want to try and work on the milestone and the slides only once and not have to go back and review for the final, you can try and be exemplary right off the get-go with the fiscal policies. And the way to do it is literally to use your scholarly sources. So if you go look, I can't seem to scroll this thing quite well tonight. So you meet proficient criteria and cite scholarly research to support the relation between the policies and the issues. So if you use your scholarly sources right off Milestone 2 to support your content correctly, you will already be exemplary for the final and you won't have to do extra work. Well, Adrian, I would ask the instructor. Some instructors are happy. I mean, when I grade it, if you might have included some historical or current events, and so you got the 100%. If my students have only fiscal policies, I give them a needs improvement. If it's a mix of both, I will give them a proficient, and I will explain though that the proficient is because you identified the goal for, but the OBRA acts are not really considered historical events. So I will be specific of, which part was good and which part could have been better. Every instructor grades differently and provides. So if your instructor was happy with it, You can ask, then all you have to do, you might have included more than what you think. Um, without seeing your PowerPoint, I can't really tell, but you might have actually included historical events, or you might have explained it so well, applying the models that it might have been enough to be proficient. It's really very depends on how the slides are developed. As I said, if a student only identifies only the fiscal policies to show the changes in GDP, then for me, they're not a proficient because they're only fiscal policies, no historical events. But every instructor, has a different, might have a different idea of what constitutes an historical event too. Or you might have explained it well. You show that you have knowledge of the macroeconomic principles, and that's enough too. Because at the end of the day, you're developing the PowerPoint to show your knowledge of what you've studied, and if that knowledge transpires from your PowerPoint, in my opinion, even if your information historically is not perfect, but you show that you have a very good grasp, then you can be proficient. You might not be exemplary, but you will be proficient because you're showing a really good grasp of the economic concepts. If you going back to the government policy, thank you. Oh, you're welcome, Jody. Yeah, the Ember, you can just when you can go on the Shapiro library too, and there's all the Ember articles. And what it'll do, like the first page will be just a brief summary. For example, Manqui rehabilitated the policies of the 50s, and it's a little brief summary, and that is going to be enough if you're researching the 50s to frame the 60s. It's just enough to get a general idea and to explain how, those policies would have been relevant. You don't have to you don't have to research the previous decade in depth as is you research your own decade, obviously, because that's just an introduction to your decade. Basically, you want to explain, why did there was 2000 start with a brief recession? It's because there was the technology bubble that was caused, that happened during the 90s. So what fiscal policies might have spurred that economic recession in the 2000 with the technology bubble, for example. And one of the things that happened in the 90s that carried into the 2000 is that Clinton had high taxes and he did the budget deficit. He balanced the budget all throughout the decade. And then towards the end of the decade, he reduced taxation. And so the economy was still going pretty fast. Reduced taxation, it kind of made it go a little bit faster. And, that might have been a little too much all at once, which caused a brief, and it was just a brief recession in the 2000. Yes, Wendy, this will be recorded. It will be posted on the SNHU Echo channel on YouTube, and I'm going to email a link to all the instructors, and they should be sharing it in the announcements. But if for some reason you don't get the link, you can go on YouTube, you search the SNHU Echo channel, and you can find it, or you can just type in Milestone 2 18EW6. And if you type that in, it will also come up because that's part of the title that I'm going to be using to upload it into YouTube. Is there any more questions? I think we've gone over the requirements pretty thoroughly. Just remember, again, when you're describing the impact, do not forget to describe the impact of the policy, not only on the economy in terms of GDP, unemployment, and inflation, use a few numbers, but also how were households and businesses affected by the fiscal policies. The link for the White House was this, if that's what you were looking for, which lists all the presidents. This could be a good starting point to find the fiscal policies. And then once you've identified what you're looking for, you can do a more in-depth research on the Shapiro Library, which is very useful. Then you're sure it's a scholarly source. You can go on the American Association, the Economics Association website, and they have more scholarly sources that could be mentioning papers. The NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, has a lot of useful sources also. So You could, there's, or just Google it. You might find Wikipedia. You're not supposed to use Wikipedia. However, you can read what's the information in Wikipedia, get an idea of what fiscal policies were used during your decade, and then do a research for more scholarly sources or a news article that will, these links. Yes, this link for the White House in general is in the sample PowerPoint for Milestone 2. If you run the PowerPoint, if you look at it, it gives you the links, but you can't click on them. But if you run it, you can click on the links. But that would be the link to the White House in general, and then you have to find the presidents. Well, this link will take you straight there. So that's the difference. Just want to make sure we don't have any more questions. Otherwise, we can wrap this up. I see someone's writing. I really suggest that you try to do the exemplary in the milestones already. The NBER website. It's the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they have papers that are in PDF. You can find NBER on the Shapiro Library too. If you go on there and you just put the policy or the decade. I mean, usually sometimes when I have to help a student, I sometimes have sources, sometimes I research them myself. I'll just go on Google and write something like fiscal policies of the 1960s. And I start looking at what I see, then I identify some keywords, and then I can narrow my search. I can focus it more on what I want to find. That's a good way to start. As I said, you can go on Wikipedia and just use it as a starting point. Do not reference it, because Wikipedia is not a valid academic source because it's an open source. Oh, yes, if you do the Control key, you can take you to the website. Thank you, Jody. The other way, if you open the PowerPoint and you don't want to run it, if you right-click on the link, the little drop-down menu comes and you can select Open Hyperlink, and then it'll go to the website. So you can do it that way too. That's another way of doing it. But thank you, Jody, also for highlighting that. Makes life easier. Sometimes you don't want to run the PowerPoint and then it changes slides pretty fast, maybe. So it's good to be able to open it without having to run it. I see a few more people writing. So I'm going to give it a few more minutes to make sure everybody has a chance to ask their questions. The sample for the presentation is under the final project supplemental resources. It's in your classroom. When you go on, in your classroom, you go on the menu up in the top left corner and you click on learning modules. When you open your learning modules, there's also the final project supplemental resources if you scroll down. If you click on those, there's all the rubrics. There's the sample for the presentation that has all the links to the websites in it. So you can go there. If you need help with any graphic representation, especially if you want to use the models, I recommend you go in the My Econ Lab, always through your course, and you find the supplemental resources or supplemental library of My Econ Lab. It's called the Multimedia Library, to be exact. My Econ Lab Multimedia Library. And if you go in there, you select the chapter, for example, the chapter on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. You can select that chapter and you can select PowerPoint presentation. You can select videos, animation, and it'll give you those resources. And the presentation that Hubbard makes is a really good summary of the chapters you read. And it really helps. 6777. Should I start with Johnson's policy since he became president in 63? Is this enough time? It could be enough time, Todd, because you could even highlight in general that the fiscal policies, the high spending of the 60s led to the increasing inflation that was already starting in 1967. I mean, the higher inflation didn't start exactly in 1970. And yes, Johnson's policies would be a good time to start framing it in 63. I would say yes. But you can also mention like the high spending of the space race contributed, to the high inflation of the decade. But if you start with Johnson, I think it's enough time to frame your decade. Because what you're really doing is you're explaining in 1967, if inflation was already going higher, why was it already going higher? So that's why you need to go back a little bit and explain how did you get to that point. And you just have to explain it briefly. So the Johnson's policies, which he focused on the war on poverty, are definitely a good starting point to explain the increasing inflation towards the end of the decade. And then obviously flowing into the 1970s. So you should be good with that. And as I said, for the models, if you use the models, usually, it helps a lot to explain the impact of the policies. And it helps you be exemplary because if you use concrete example to substantiate claims and describe the policy results, well, a concrete example could be using a model too. I see Nicole writing. Any more questions? If we don't have any more questions after Nicole, Sabrina. If you get your fiscal policies milestone right, then the monetary policies milestone 3 is a breeze because you're going to apply exactly the same method. Oh, thank you, Sabrina. Good night. Nicole, yes, it should be like a brief essay, like your speaker notes should be in sentences and paragraph format, not in bullet points. It's not so much how much you have to add. There's not like a length. I would say usually to explain the fiscal policies, you probably need a paragraph per fiscal policy that you identify, a brief paragraph, because you're going to explain what the fiscal policy does and what the intent. So for example, if the fiscal policy is the Highway Act, which increased government spending by building new highways, why did Eisenhower want to build new highways? And so you're explaining the intent. So you might need a paragraph to explain each fiscal policy. Oh, you're welcome. And thank you very much. You have a great night too. I'm assuming all the questions have been asked. So I'm going to end the webinar and I'll see you next week for a webinar on my